It is Oklahoma football time here at the Voice of College Football. We welcome all of you to jump on in and jump in the live chat. Of course, leave those comments, those questions, those debate topics for our Sooners live show that comes your way each and every Friday at 2:30 Eastern, 1:30 there in Oklahoma. And, of course, please subscribe to the channel. Hit that bell for the notifications because the deal is that we've got Jason here. We've got myself. We've got schedules to work out, so we can't always make it on Friday, but we certainly are here every week. So when you hit that bell for the notifications, you know when we're going live so you can keep up with our schedule changes. Jason, how are we doing today?
Good, Mark. How are you?
I'm doing great. Look forward to another show here. We've been off to a nice, successful start, so we appreciate everybody out there that's joined us each and every week to talk Oklahoma football. And please keep in mind that if you enjoy the content, if you enjoy being here, and if you love Oklahoma football, or by extension, many of you just college football fans, well, I'm sure you know a ton of Oklahoma fans that are family, friends, just people that you interact with on social media, so let them know that we are here every Friday. Okay. We are going to talk so much recruiting in the next few weeks, as you can imagine, with the big recruiting weekends coming up, everyone. So not a whole lot on that with this weekend just starting to launch that first weekend wave. But once we get into next weekend, we're going to be talking so much recruiting in regards to the visits and then the decisions by the student athletes. All right. We also will go down our Big 12 wide receiver rankings here soon. Check out the videos where we ranked both the quarterbacks and the running backs right here on our Oklahoma channel. All right, Jason, let's line it up in regards to the news of the day. There's some speculation concerning LSU running back KEVONTRE Bradford, who has now officially entered the transfer portal.
Yeah, there's been a lot of discussion, over the last couple of weeks, almost 3 weeks, about, a guy that Oklahoma could look at as a replacement for Seth McGowan, who is no longer with the program. So Bradford is a guy that has been on the radar for a while, really almost 3 or 4 weeks. Has been a guy ever since their spring game, had a little bit of an injury in the spring, didn't really play a whole lot in their spring game, and was behind a couple of kids there at LSU, and is a guy that was looking, and Oklahoma, appears to be, a pretty attractive landing spot, not only for him, but for Oklahoma looking to kind of bolster that depth for this upcoming season. We talked about Eric Gray and Kennedy Brooks are going to be, kind of 1A and 1B, depending on how you look at it and where that kind of falls in line. But, behind him, you got Marcus Major, who played sparingly last year, played a little bit more towards the end of the season. But outside of that, there's not a whole lot of depth. And I think looking into it specifically from a coaching perspective, and then, as a fan watching and looking at that, when you have, three guys that will typically, help you, you probably want to have another kid for, injury comes up, whatever happens. So he's a 4-star guy, top 150 kid in the 2019 recruiting class. He'll be a sophomore, actually probably a redshirt freshman this upcoming year, if he decides to go to Oklahoma or wherever he goes. So he'll be a good guy. He'll be a good guy to supplement that depth for Oklahoma. Not sure if he's a guy that would be, would fight for a lot of playing time. Mike could get in the mix there with Marcus Major there. But I think it's a good, when you look at Oklahoma from a future perspective, you got Eric Gray, who's a kid that if he plays well, has a good season, certainly he could go early. Kennedy Brooks kind of the same way. And he was a guy that, with him setting out this year, he was looking to make a move to the NFL possibly. So if both of those kids have really good seasons, you could see a guy like Trey Bradford come in and be able to kind of wait his turn and kind of and come in for Oklahoma. So it's something to look for in the next couple of weeks or so to see where he lands. Hasn't really announced any sort of visits or any of his top choices right now, but certainly a person to look for Oklahoma, potentially bolstering some of that depth in the running back room.
Appreciate everybody joining the chat. Again, you ultimately produce the show, so we certainly have our lineup of what we're going to talk about, but leave your comments and your questions, and we will get to them. Brittany, that's great to hear that you could finally make the live show. So for anybody who can't make the live show, of course, join the Rewatch Squad. As a lot of people that I am in contact with like to say, hashtag Rewatch Squad. So join us there, but we'd love to have as many people live as possible because we can engage with you. So Brittany, it's good to see you here live. We also have about 25 to 30 on the line already with Patrick in here joining us live. Good to see you as well. All right, Jason, before we get to our next topic, Brittany's hitting us with a question concerning who will make the biggest impact for the Sooners from all the new guys, whether they're freshmen or transfers?
Yeah, so from a freshman perspective, we can kind of start there. Offensively, Mario Williams is a guy that, if he doesn't start, he's going to get plenty of playing time. Looked the part in the spring game. There was a lot of hype for him early on in the preseason from a spring practice perspective, but he played well in the spring game. With the loss of Trajan Bridges, he'll be a kid that will play some. Kind of depends, him, and it's kind of an interesting discussion. Not necessarily, obviously not a freshman, but he's kind of a late transfer. Mike Woods from Arkansas. Be interesting to see how those two interact. Just in terms of who gets more team time, where do they move him? Do they move those guys around a little bit from the slot to outside or inside? What does that look like for them? So in the transfer, kind of actually, let's keep on the freshman side here. Moving on to the defensive side, you got a guy named Billy Bowman who will probably play. He'll factor into that nickel back position at least from a at least to provide depth if he doesn't get that starting job. Played a lot in the spring game, played really well against Marvin Mims in the slot. A lot of times he was matched up one-on-one, covered, and really just it didn't necessarily look like a freshman out there. Other than that, those are probably the two guys that I would say from a true freshman perspective really have a chance to make a lot of noise, early on for the Sooners and some spots of need. Moving on to the kind of the transfer side, really a lot more impact there from my perspective on the offensive line. You got Wanye Morris coming over from Tennessee, who I would expect him to at some point lock down that left tackle position for Oklahoma. We talked a lot about Eric Gray. We'll get a lot of, we'll be the kind of the 1A, 1B punch with Kennedy Brooks there. Mike Woods is another guy that's going to play a lot that we just mentioned for Oklahoma as well. On the defensive side, you got Key Lawrence from a safety perspective. He will kind of factor into that rotation as well. So a lot of good transfers and freshmen that'll see some playing time for Oklahoma this year.
Talking Sooners with all of you and Jason Ray from Last Word on College Football. Jason makes this happen each and every week. So not that you won't see other contributors on here, but if you dive into this Oklahoma channel, you're going to see a whole lot of Jason breaking down the Sooners and myself as well at times, of course. But we certainly give it up for the experts first. So you're going to hear from me when I got something to say. But Jason's the guy that puts his neck on the line because he answers all the questions. I just dive in when I feel like it. No, so we do all the team channels, so check those out as well. If you're not a Oklahoma fan, we got 22 team channels. And again, Jason's work at Last Word on College Football. All right. Yeah, this was quite interesting concerning the game times that were announced for the first few weeks of the season and then the backlash coming from Oklahoma AD Joe Castiglione. So if I catch this right, I don't want to mess up the game times. Two of the first three are 11 a.m. Central. The Tulane game opening weekend, and 2 weeks later against Nebraska. And of course, it was that Nebraska game that caught a lot of people's attention because of the magnitude of the brand names and possibly anticipating that that was going to be at another time. And then some other people chimed in on social media. I'm sure you're way ahead of this compared to me, Jason, but I saw a number of people start to do a little addition and look back on previous seasons and say Oklahoma's had its fair share, if not way too many, what would be noon Eastern time, but 11 a.m. local time kickoffs for a team, a program of Oklahoma's status.
Yeah, it's very interesting, Mark. This has been a discussion that has gained a little bit of legs over the last few years with to your point, a lot of people around here feeling that Oklahoma's getting maybe too many of their fair share of 11 a.m. kickoff games. So I think it's an interesting discussion to have, Mark, when you look at, maybe guys like us that are just sitting around on the couch watching TV on the Saturday, watching football on the Saturday morning. I think whoever it is, whether it's Oklahoma or whoever your favorite team, I think you're probably excited to have that as an early game, so you don't have to wait around all day for your team to kick off. But unfortunately, there's a lot of other components to that. So I think for a game like Nebraska, where this is Oklahoma's biggest, outside of Iowa State, it's their biggest home game of the year, specifically a named team like Nebraska. It's 50 years ago of the game of the century commemoration. I think Oklahoma had planned on a statue unveiling. And so, there's a lot of contributors that kind of come into that 11 a.m. kickoff. Oklahoma is a national brand, so Oklahoma has, they have fans that are coming in from out of town and things like that. They have recruiting. They have people that are coming in for official visits. It's almost impossible for those kids to come to an 11 a.m. game unless it's local in the state of Oklahoma, without having to miss their Friday night game from a high school perspective. And then you think about the merchants, and you think about a lot of those sports bars and grills and restaurants and things like that where they rely on Saturday game days, and they would love to have those 6 p.m., 7 p.m. games local time to kind of bolster that revenue that they count on. So I think overall it's really just a bad, I think, experience. I think the writing was on the wall a little bit, when a couple of weeks ago we heard that Fox was picking up this game, and it's really kind of it's an interesting differentiator because ABC, ESPN, their primetime slot is the 6:30, 7 p.m. game every week, and for Fox, their primetime slot is the 11 a.m. game. So I think a lot of people thought that this might come, but I think more interestingly enough, when it was unveiled a week ago, Mark, that Castiglione actually took to Twitter and took to social media to talk about they tried everything that they possibly could with Fox to be able to move that game around, and with it being their number one primetime slot, they were just in a position that they were unwilling to move that. So I mean, I think it's one of those things. There's always discussion about conference realignment. I think Oklahoma, from a tier 3 TV rights perspective, it's something that I think they're looking at. I think that that contract expires in 24, 25. So, I think it's really just one of those things that's unfortunate that happens, for the fans and the experience overall early on in the year. But, something that fans and media are kind of accustomed to. And, they'll have that, to your point, two out of the first 3 games. And, the other one that hasn't been announced yet, but it's almost always 11 a.m. kickoff is the game against Texas and Dallas. So they'll have their fair share of early on, but maybe it'll. You would like to think that it would even out later in the year as those games are announced.
I'm guessing the players themselves don't like to play early.
It's very interesting. that you asked that, Mark, because there was a couple of players that took to Twitter really after because it's kind of went a little bit viral locally. There was a couple of players that went to social media and said that they actually prefer the early games. They don't, kind of the same way that maybe, I don't know, maybe fans are watching. They would like they enjoy, getting up, getting breakfast, and going out and playing early. So I thought that was really interesting. I would have been kind of like you. I would have thought that they would like most kids, when you come from high school, you play under the lights every single game, right? And they would like to experience that same thing. But I guess the mentality may be a little bit different with some of these kids these days.
Yeah, and the flip side to that argument, to continue your point, I would think would be, especially when you're playing an extremely big game, maybe just the nerves building all day and just wanting to get to the game and just waiting and waiting and waiting all day with nothing to do, and you can't relax, you can't enjoy yourself. You want to get to the game and get on the field. So I can see both aspects there. Just to extend on your point, as you outlined, ABC and ESPN have been in the college football game forever. Fox is newer to the regular season college football. Fox joined in on college football in the early to mid 2000s and really put their stake on the BCS championship game and a couple major bowl games, but they didn't broadcast any regular season games, which was kind of odd. All of a sudden they show up for championship games. But then Fox got into it about 5 or 6 years ago. So then Fox, as a counter-programming tactic, strategy, knew that it would be difficult for them to wrestle away those primetime audiences away from ABC and ESPN, especially since ABC and ESPN have contracts with all 5 major conferences. Yeah. For Fox, it's the Big 12, the Big 10, and the Pac-12. So they don't have the SEC and the ACC. Therefore, it's a smaller selection of games. So ABC and ESPN generally have the opportunity to have better games. Not all the time, but have that opportunity because of having 2 additional conferences, one of them being the SEC. So a couple of years ago, Fox made what has been argued on both sides, a strategic maneuver to say, okay, our prime game is going to be at noon Eastern, 11 Central. We're going to put our best game there because it's generally thought of as you go through the day that the best games are in prime time. Yep. And maybe that next tier is at that 3:30, 2:30 Central window. You see a lot of good games there, and mostly the best games are not at noon. That's the warm-up for the big college football fan that turn on the TV at 11 a.m. Eastern or 11 a.m. Central to watch those games. So we're going to counter that by saying, here's our best game. And so there are various, inconveniences or preferences from the fan bases and from the players, as Jason outlined. But from a sheer strategy standpoint of trying to gain the most views, that's what Fox has gone to. The one thing I will say about the statement made by Castiglione is that the conference signs a contract. The conference has the agreement of the members of the schools, 10 in the Big 12, and they know what the deal is. I understand you may have a preference of when you play, but in terms of making it public of your dissatisfaction of when these games are scheduled, when you and your football program and the entire conference has made a decision to sign a contract. It could have been placed in the contract. No particular school will play X number of games before noon Central Time, or there could have been stipulations made in the contract, but there obviously weren't. So you have given the television network carte blanche to schedule these games whenever they want. So I don't think there's really anything to complain about.
No, and I'm with you, and I saw this. I think one of the things that would be interesting, and I don't know how you consider, especially if a team's outside of the top 25, a marquee game But I think, one of the things that, if it would have been, if they would have been playing a TCU, or they would have been playing their game against Western Carolina, maybe there's not as much, there's not as much impact there. But I see what you're saying. I agree with you. I think it would be interesting to see. Someone did a breakdown of some of the top 4 teams and how many 11 a.m. games, 2:30, 6 evening kickoffs. And it was pretty even among the top 4 or 5 schools within the country, that they're pretty consistent. But I think it all depends on what type of game there is there. But yeah, I mean, I'm with you. I mean, it is what it is. It's one of those things where, to your point, they actually, there was no stipulations within the contract to my knowledge. So you're kind of at the network's mercy. Whatever they decide to do is certainly what they'll do, and how they'll exercise their right. And Fox has every every reason to do that. And I think it's interesting because when you talk about the Fox broadcast, I think Gus Johnson and Joel Klatt are solid as their number one team. One of the best in the business, and over the years they have been very pro Oklahoma. Specifically, Joel Klatt has been very pro Oklahoma. And now you have Bob Stoops kind of joining the pregame, their big noon Fox telecast. So, I think Oklahoma's put a lot of their balls in Fox's court, so to speak. So it's interesting to see how this, maybe this relationship will go, throughout the remainder of the Tier 3 TV deal.
Brittany, to answer your question or comment there on the screen, the college football expansion of all these conferences, and most of that took place roughly 10 years ago, when Nebraska left, Colorado left, Texas A&M and Missouri went to the SEC. All the moves that were made, the Big Ten added Maryland and Rutgers, all happened within about 3 to 4 years. And what it did is obviously expanded the conferences, and it tore up rivalries like Texas A&M, Oklahoma, Nebraska, and others. And I get the point that you would love to see Oklahoma and Nebraska play every year. I loved that game. It was tradition as much as anything in college football. But the issue that I see, Jason, is just the number of games played. So Oklahoma and Nebraska both play in conferences that play 9-game conference seasons. So they only have 3 non-conference games to schedule. Well, if they always play each other, they're going to be hesitant about scheduling another big opponent. Because if you're, let's say, Nebraska, and Oklahoma is consistently a top 3 to 5 team in the country, you're not going to want to go out and schedule somebody else like that to have 2 of those on your schedule. Well, then if you're only playing Oklahoma every year, then that becomes a very predictable, boring schedule in which you basically play 2 FCS/group of 5s, and then you always play Oklahoma, and it doesn't really help recruiting, and it doesn't really help your brand. It's kind of like Iowa State. I always, when I outline the schedules and do my schedule previews, I always say that Iowa State plays the most boring schedule in the country. This is the reason why. They play everybody in the conference, and then they always play Iowa, and then they don't play anybody else because they play their one big game. It's always Iowa. So I know exactly what the Iowa State schedule is going to be every year.
Right.
So that's the only hang up I see in trying to renew that rivalry every year.
Yeah, no, completely agree, Mark. And I think it's a discussion that we'll have more and more. With Oklahoma, Nebraska, you at Texas A&M. There's a lot of rivalries that have been, for lack of a better word, ruined because of some of the conference realignment that's happened. And look, it's only going to happen more and more, right? I think. And interestingly, it's an interesting conversation, kind of like the playoff expansion. As we, especially as we get into the next 4 or 5 years, what does that conference realignment look like? Me personally, I don't necessarily see the Big 12 in it for the long term. At least exactly what the Big 12 looks like today. I think I wouldn't be surprised to see Oklahoma and some of the big schools in the Big 12, Oklahoma, Oklahoma State, Texas, maybe look at exiting the conference. You may see you may see Iowa State, Kansas State. Some of those teams still stay in with maybe a not as top heavy conference. So there's been a lot of discussions. Does Oklahoma look to the SEC? There was some rumors that the SEC wanted Oklahoma and Oklahoma State together. A few years ago. Do they do that? Then I think most assuredly Texas will not join the SEC. If anything, if the Big 12 kind of implodes in the way it is, I would see them going independent, maybe like a Notre Dame before they would join an SEC. So if that happens, what the same conversation happens if you're Oklahoma and you're in the SEC and then you play Texas every single year. Are you going to be willing to play them as a non-conference opponent, knowing, let's just say for argument's sake, Oklahoma does go to the SEC, knowing how tough of a conference schedule that is? Would that be a rivalry at some point that would possibly leave? So I think it's interesting to monitor this stuff over the next few years, but absolutely agree with your point, Mark, and that's really the number one reason why we're seeing some of these rivalries go away, and specifically why they won't be scheduled every year.
Yeah, now if we're talking more fantasy land in terms of people throwing together schedules and conference alignments, I thought that from a purely football standpoint, not talking about money or other athletic endeavors, that Texas A&M and Missouri, that they just culturally and from a football standpoint belong in the Big 12. I don't think that they should have left the Big 12. And again, it may have benefited them. I don't know what the money exchange is, but I just think from a football standpoint that Texas A&M and Missouri belong in the Big 12. Missouri is not an SEC team, but it is what it is right now. Right. And so for me, it's Texas A&M and Missouri, but they're in the SEC. So if the Big 12 would expand, I would think that there's a lot of potential at the University of Houston. The football talent in that city is ridiculous.
Right. Yeah.
And of course, they've played big time football. They've played in the Southwest Conference, and we're a major player at a certain period of time. And then where you would go for another team, you could look to Boise State, which I don't think they really help you in terms of eyeballs or money, but from a football playing standpoint, they're certainly similar to what TCU was. Right. When they joined the conference, the highest of highs in the group of five. BYU, there might be some odd dynamic there of them joining any conference just based on their value system, their beliefs, and how that affects their athletics. But Houston's the first school that comes to mind for me for the Big 12. I don't want to get caught in the moment because Memphis has been good at football for a few years now, but that's not always the case. So I don't know if they have what it takes to play in the league consistently.
No, I think you're absolutely right, Mark. I think Houston was a good, and I think that was part of the conversation before when I think the Big 12 was really deciding do they get back to 12 or do they stay at 10? So I think Houston's a good team. Boise State is a good team to kind of to talk about. UCF is another team, from a football only perspective. That's been good. BYU very, very attractive. I think specifically from an eyeball perspective is one of those things. As Patrick's illustrating here, West Virginia's an odd one to be in the Big 12. I mean, very much to your point, like Missouri and Texas A&M, West Virginia. I mean, they're good for the conference. Don't get me wrong, but it's exactly the point that's being made here. How much they have to travel in every sport. So it'll be interesting to see how that works. I know back when you can make a case that Nebraska belongs in the Big 10 or the Big 12. I mean, historically, obviously they've been a Big 8, Big 12 team, but their move over to the Big 10, and I don't know how happy they are there now. So yeah, I think those things will be interesting. And there's a balance act, right? You want to look at how good a team is from a football perspective, and then you got the eyeball. How many TV sets do you have there, and then you have the travel. Probably lower down the totem pole is kind of in terms of exactly how many. What do they bring to others from the other sports perspective? I know that football really sets the bar there, but yeah, that'll be interesting. And I've heard some stuff about Oklahoma potentially Big Ten, SEC, or do they stay put? I think one thing that is interesting here, Mark, is can Oklahoma win or challenge a national championship while they're in the Big 12? If they feel like we've got to be a part of a conference that has another heavyweight or another couple heavyweights within them to, whether it's helping with recruiting or just helping to strengthen the conference with Texas being down, they're that team that Oklahoma would like them to be, but they haven't necessarily been there over the last few years. But so can they? Are they strong enough to win a national championship over the next few years? So I think that'll be part of the decision making as well.
Yeah, Jason Ray on the line, as we always do. He makes our Oklahoma show go. We've done it 5 consecutive weeks here live every Friday. And when we say every Friday, that means that's the scheduled time. But certainly subscribe to the channel and hit that bell for the notifications, because sometimes we've got to switch up based on work schedules elsewhere and vacations and so forth. So we want you to be here with us live each and every week. So subscribe, hit the bell for the notifications. That way you do know when we're going live. And keep this in mind. If you love Oklahoma, love college football, we see Scott's here. He's a Texas fan. We appreciate him being here. And other fan bases are repped. Let people know that we're here talking college football. If you enjoy it, others will as well. Let them know that we're here talking college football. It'd be great to have 10 times as many people in here by the time we hit August camp and look toward game number 1 against Tulane. We see a ton of questions there. We will get to as many as possible. We do have a bit of a time limitation, and we are presenting to you Big 12 position rankings. So we knocked out the quarterbacks, and we reviewed the running backs last week. So check out those live streams, and we're going to do the wide receivers today. I'll make one more point about West Virginia. Make one more point about the West Virginia case about them being in the Big 12. I bet if you took just about any commit or recruit within the Big 12 footprint and looked at their offer list and what schools they're reviewing, like if you looked at Kansas State's list or Texas Tech's list, you would see run down on other players and look at their offer sheet and look at who they're considering. And most of that's going to be within the Big 12 footprint. A Texas player is going to be looking at Oklahoma as well, and possibly Oklahoma State. And again, a Texas Tech player is also looking at Baylor and is also looking at, other schools. If you look at the best players in the state of West Virginia that play high school football, I guarantee you that if they're not looking at West Virginia, they have no connection to the Big 12. The Big 12 is not on their offer sheet, nor the list of schools that they're looking at. There's just no connection between the two. Now it's worked out. They're a quality football team. It works out from a competitive standpoint. They fit in the league and add value to the league. It's difficult to match up rivalries, unless West Virginia turns out to be one of the best teams in the Big 12, and you would naturally have a rivalry with the other best team in the conference. Who's their rival? They don't have a rival. Mm-hmm. They've been putting them together most years. Correct me if I'm wrong, Jason, with Iowa State on the final weekend of the season, and are they 1,000 miles away? So.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. And there's a couple of conferences that are like that. We've talked about the SEC with with Missouri and Texas A&M, that's kind of an odd fit. But West Virginia is extremely odd to your point about not only the travel, but you're thinking about the recruiting. There's not a rival that they have there in the conference. And, there's some other teams. I mean, Rutgers kind of comes to mind from the Big Ten. That's a little bit of an odd, I mean, not necessarily geographically, but just in terms of, who they play and stuff like that. And it's, it's interesting. And, those things, I think, tend to happen across other conferences. And so, but just the first question, I want to make sure that if we have time real quick, just very briefly, just kind of respond to that. So from a Texas perspective, I think, from a recruiting evaluation perspective, I think that's a big thing that they've struggled with over the last few years, particularly at the quarterback position. I think and I don't know, and this shows my ignorance from that perspective. Sam Ellinger was probably one of the best quarterbacks that they've had, especially in recent history. What I don't know is how highly recruited a guy he was. I don't think he was incredibly highly recruited. So they've lost a lot of talent at the quarterback position. And I think, we've talked about this a lot. The things that the coach really has to go through, kind of extracurricular things that they have to go through with the boosters and, things that Texas, is a challenge that, may not all head coaches or all administrators are able to get through. So, I mean, I think Sark is going to do a good job. I mean, I don't necessarily think that Herman did a good job. I think he was certainly better than Charlie Strong, obviously, but kind of remains to be seen obviously what Sark can do. But I mean, I think those are the few of the things that I see kind of in my view of of why Texas hasn't been quite as good as certainly Texas fans would expect.
All right. Each week, Jason and I have brought you our Big 12 position rankings. We looked at the top 10 quarterbacks, both Jason's list and myself, and also the running backs we did last week. So check out those videos. This week, we're going to tackle the wide receivers and tight ends. And disclaimer here is that I was traveling all day yesterday, and I had 3 other live streams today, and I didn't rank my wide receivers and tight ends, so we're going to rely completely on Jason here. And we'll run down his top 10, and I'll have a few things I'd like to say, of course, and I also looked at some of the honorable mention candidates. All right, Big 12 wide receivers / tight ends.
Yeah, so it's just as a disclaimer before this, for me, this one was a lot tougher than the quarterbacks and the running backs. You have obviously there's more wide receivers and tight ends, and how do you rank a tight end versus a wide receiver, and and there's maybe more true in this position, in this position top 10 than any of the other ones was. I was very firm on who I think is the best individual player, maybe not necessarily the position, tight end versus wide receiver or the production that I think that they will garner this year, but more of the kind of the individual players. So starting at number 10, Brennan Presley from Oklahoma State. Kind of interesting kid. Had one catch. I think if I'm going back and looking at my stats, right, one catch through the regular season, and then had 6 for over 100 and 3 touchdowns in their bowl game against the Cheez-It Bowl against Miami. Here locally, pretty close to me from Bixby High School here in the Tulsa area. He's a kid with with the loss that they have at wide receiver, has an opportunity to be one of the go-to kids. Really exciting kid to be able to run after the catch, very elusive, good hands. So he'll be in a position of need for Oklahoma State with a couple of their big receivers leaving this year.
All right, on to number 9.
Number 9, I have Austin Stogner from Oklahoma, and from a tight end perspective, for me, a bit of the unknown with him, Mark, is how he's able to respond from his injury and his staph infection that he had last year. Really, some of those details came to light before the spring, and it was one of the things with Wagner where myself wasn't personally aware of how close he was to, to being in really, really critically bad shape. So, came back. Credit to him. Came back and played late. And played in the bowl game a little bit against Florida. He looked good. A little bit rusty maybe in the spring game, but he's a guy who had had 26 catches for over 400 yards just last year, and about 7 or 8 games. So, from a tight end perspective, I have Stockner here at number 9. Number 8, I have Joshua Moore from Texas. So, he's a guy 30 catches, 472 yards last year. He had a really big year, 9 touchdowns. So he'll be counted on, really as being one of their number 1 receivers for Texas. It'll be interesting to see who's coming passes. Is it KP? Is it Hudson Ford, Casey Thompson, Hudson Ford? But he'll get a lot of opportunities. Last year with the 30 catches, you would expect that to, maybe go up a little bit based on what he has been able to do in the past. Then number 7 from West Virginia, I have Winston Wright. One of the more productive, seasons last year in Big 12. 47 catches for 533 yards just a year ago. Has a good quarterback throwing it to him, so he has the opportunity to put up some yards. Only 2 touchdowns. You'd like to see him kind of improving that a little bit with West Virginia and get that opportunity there. So I have Winston Wright at number 7. Number 6.
I'm sorry, Jason. And as you mentioned with Wright, I think that with Jared Dagey being in the offense another year, them opening things up a little bit more. Of course, they only played 10 games. They should play 13 with a bowl game this season. We could see him catch. Shoot, he just caught 47 passes last year. He could catch 70 this upcoming season.
Absolutely. Completely agree there. So at number 6, I have R.J. Sneed from Baylor. We talked a little bit about Baylor in the last rankings when we looked at Treston Ebner at the running position. R.J. Sneed, as you have from a career perspective, almost has very, very close to 1,000 yards in his career. Had 39 catches for 497 yards last year, and really with a team that really struggled offensively throughout the year. So, interesting. It will be interesting to see how improved they are. And they were in the second year overall for Baylor. So he'll need to have some good production from a quarterback, whoever that ends up being starting for Baylor. But with his 40 catches, about 40 catches in a shortened season, I've got Sneed there at number 6.
Yeah, Gavin Holmes is another receiver for Baylor who had, from a statistical standpoint, a very interesting season in which he caught 33 passes for only 244 yards. So he only had about 7 yards per reception, and that's out of a wide receiver. So I got to think he's not. And again, I don't want to make a judgment on a player. Did I watch Baylor play last year? Aside from a series here and a series there, no, they just were off the map at 2 and 7. But Holmes at 7 yards per catch at a wide receiver position, you got to think that's a lot of screens, a lot of bubble screens, and it's also him not breaking any tackles in the open field on some of the other plays. But 46 catches, 3 touchdowns on his career, so it's a guy that has been fairly productive in the Baylor system.
Yeah, absolutely. And then number 5, getting in the top 5 here, I got Eric Ezukama from Texas Tech. Almost 1,500 yards in his career. Last year has about 750. overall with 6 touchdowns. I feel like he's a kid that could shoot up, maybe not necessarily as an overall wide receiver, but just from a productivity perspective, with Tyler Shuck there this year for Texas Tech. Be that as it may, they're going to throw the ball around a little bit. I know that Matt Wells is looking for a little bit more balance in the Red Raiders offense, but still, they're still going to, they're still going to chuck it around. And Ezekama had one of the better seasons in the year last year from a Big 12 wide receiver production perspective, with those 748 yards and 6 touchdowns. So Ezekama here just enters the top 5 for me.
All right. As we get to your top 4, we see another tight end who seems like he's been around forever.
He has, and looking at his stats, he's got this will be his 4th year, playing with considerable amount of playing time for Iowa State. So Charlie Kolar, 106 catches, 1,425 yards as you have here. And just last year, 44 catches, 591 yards. So in a shortened season. So I think more than anything, when you look at him, and I think there might be some people that are kind of looking. You have Charlie Kolar at number 4 above some really talented wide receivers, but I think the matchup problem that he provides, he can almost take one side of the field away in terms of an offensive perspective. When you can just at 6'7", where you can just kind of throw him the ball and let him go up and get it, against some of those smaller safeties. So, and he's with the talent that they have, he will, not only at the receiver position, but at the running back with Brees Hall, he'll garner a lot of one-on-one type situations for him. So I have him, for me, as the top tight end in the conference and number 4 in the ranking there.
All right. Once we get to number 3, we've got one of Max Dubin's favorite targets.
Yeah, Quentin Johnston, and when I looked at his, obviously last year with his first year in the program competing, 22.1 yards per catch, so a game breaker at that position. When you see game breaker, and you only see 2 touchdowns. That's a little interesting. He's a guy that was really good at being able to stretch the field. We talked a lot about Dubin, about he's steadily improved as a passer over the last couple of years. He's got a lot of weapons, at the running back position when you talk about Zach Evans and that he brings to that position. So if he could be 1,000-yard receiver, I think, for TCU this year, if Dugan is able to be as effective as I think the Horned Frogs need him to be.
Yeah, he's the guy that stretches the field for Gary Patterson. Also a guy to keep your eye on for the Horned Frogs would be Tate Barber, who plays in the slot. He's at about 10 yards per catch, whereas Johnston's stretching the field at 20-plus yards, 22 yards per catch. But Barber's caught 92 passes in his career, 31 last year.
So with number 2, I have Xavier Hutchinson from Iowa State. As you have here, this was his first full year as a starter for the Cyclones. Was extremely impressive. 64 catches, 771 yards in a shortened season. Exactly how you mentioned about Winston Wright. This could have been a kid that could have been an 80, 85 catch guy last year, over 1,000 yards, perhaps in a regular season for Iowa State. He's obviously their number 1 target from a wide receiver position. So when we get to the number 1 guy, I'll kind of compare those two. But would fully expect him in another year in the program to be that guy that's going to catch 70 to 80 balls and approach 1,000 yards receiving and maybe up that touchdown area a little bit more.
Absolutely. And here we go, Jason. Your number 1 wide receiver in the Big 12.
So for number 1, I have Marvin Mims, and when we go through this, I look at as you mentioned, I look at player by player and look who I think would be the better individual player. And I think Marvin Mims really has a chance to do that as a true freshman. You have 37 catches, 600 yards, but he had 9 touchdowns. When you look at that, almost almost a third of his catches, went for touchdowns last year, maybe closer to a fourth. But I think when you look at production with who all Oklahoma has at the wide receiver position, I think you're going to see Hutchinson have more productivity through this year. I don't think that you'll see Marvin Mims be a 1,000-yard receiver. Maybe 700, 800 yards is what I would see, or what I would say that you could possibly look at Mims' ceiling. But I have him just slightly, very, very slightly, and I kind of went back and forth between Mims and Hutchinson 1 versus 2, but landed on Mims just because of, more so than anything, his average is a little bit higher than Hutchinson's. His touchdowns he'll maybe get a little bit more opportunities through the year than Hutchinson might.
Jason, did you have any consideration for Theo Weiss?
He was a guy that was probably when I wrote down about 12 or 13 guys, he was number 11, so he would have been certainly as an honorable mention for a wide receiver position. Was pretty productive last year as well. He was another guy that from spreading the ball out, not sure exactly how many touches he's going to get, how much he's going to get from a productivity perspective. So yeah, thought about him, but just outside of the top 10.
A couple guys that I took note of as well, in addition to some of the guys I sprinkled in there. Jabastin Taylor is Kansas State's biggest receiving threat. He's got 32 in his career, 3 touchdowns, 19 last year, and he's a huge target at 6'4". Of course, Kansas State's not going to throw the ball all over the field, but when they do, he's the guy that's most likely going to come up with the big plays. Back to West Virginia. On the other side of the formation, you got Bryce Ford Wheaton, who in a first season for West Virginia really stood out with 27 catches, 416 yards, so about 15 yards per reception, 3 touchdowns. Not going to help them this year, but it's interesting to note that Kansas had 2 really good players there in Andrew Parchment, who's transferred to Florida State, unfortunately for the Jayhawks, and Kwame Lassiter, who had some nice numbers, but has signed a free agent contract with the Arizona Cardinals. I thought that he might come back since he had another year of eligibility, but he is off to the NFL. So there's Jason's Big 12 wide receiver / tight end rankings. Somebody noted there in the chat that somebody must have a radio on. My apologies. I usually have the microphone and the earpiece and that sort of thing. We've got some noise going on here in the house, so that's what we've got going on this week. All right, Jason. Appreciate you being here as always. We did have a number of other questions there in the chat, but keep in mind that with this first huge, enormous weekend of recruiting really getting started as we record this, a lot of the big activities and the campus visits starting on this Friday, the 4th, that we'll have a whole lot to talk about next week and throughout the rest of June and July, even and beyond, with student athletes making their visits and then making their decisions on through the summer. So we look forward to that. And of course, join us here on our Oklahoma channel. You'll see more content with Jason, and full transparency here is we'll take oftentimes these long form live streams, and then we'll break those down into topics that if you're only interested in a particular topic, whatever that may be, that you can lock in on that and check those out. All right, Jason, appreciate you being here as always. It's always a good time, and want to remind everyone to head on over to Last Word on College Football as I pull up the banner here, where you can track all of Jason's work right there. All right, sir. Good to see you.
Yeah, you too. Thanks for having me. Enjoyed it.
Absolutely. See everybody next week.